nobody that was meaner and said horrible things about Vice President Biden than Kamala, even worse than Pocahontas, right? She was nastier and meaner and more vicious than Pocahontas. So now you have Kamala.
The mudslinging has begun. Joe Biden's vice presidential running mate Kamala Harris is facing accusations and attacks from all sides, with some questioning her leadership, her character, even her citizenship. So is the international community ready for the first American woman of color vice president? I'm Maggie John. Our next guest says the more we see women in leadership, the more society feels it necessary to demean their contributions. Professor Sylvia Bashevkin from the University of Toronto, thank you for joining us today.
My pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
So let's start with that first question. Do you think that the international community is ready for a woman of color vice president when, for the most part, world leaders are men, with women making up a small percentage?
Well, look, I think the world community has to simply get used to changes, right? There were questions about whether the world could get accustomed to an African-American man in the White House. And, the world did not end in 2008 with the election of President Obama. So I think there are always people who have trouble addressing changes in society, but there are large numbers of people, I think, who are ready to see a more diverse political leadership that looks more like the general population.
We do remember Michelle Obama being vilified during her husband's first campaign, being called angry. Talk about some of the implicit biases that maybe women of color face more than their white counterparts.
Well, I think there's a lot of biases that white women face and that are compounded when a woman is carrying both female gender and African-American background in the United States. So if we just look at the one of the earliest examples in the Democratic Party of a woman being on the ticket as a vice presidential nominee, we can look at Geraldine Ferraro in 1984, selected by the presidential nominee that year, Walter Mondale. So in a book I wrote, Women as Foreign Policy Leaders, I talk about how in the vice presidential debates of 1984 between then Vice President George H.W. Bush and Geraldine Ferraro, there had been an agreement that she would refer to him as Vice President Bush, and he would refer to her as Congresswoman Ferraro. Now, very soon, off the bat in that debate, he started referring to her as Mrs. Ferraro, taking away any degree of credibility about her qualifications for the office of vice president. He then began to demean her foreign policy expertise, and it wasn't unique to Vice President Bush. She went on many, many different television and radio programs, often hosted by journalists who were assumed to be sympathetic to the Democrats. And they asked her questions about, could she take a 4 a.m. wake-up phone call in the case of an attack? Could she press the nuclear button? There were many, many questions that were asked about a white, middle-class, experienced politician like Geraldine Ferraro. So I think that these discomforts are just compounded when we see a woman from African-American and South Asian background. That's not to say that these women aren't very effective at pushing back. I mean, we know that in the polls after that debate between Bush and Ferraro, American women tended to see it as a draw. They tended to see it as a situation where Ferraro had at least held her own.
You've just echoing what you said also in your book, as you speak of foreign policy leaders, women as foreign policy leaders, the fact that women can sometimes be more assertive than men are. That's something that you have found, as well as you've studied Geraldine and so many others. So a misnomer that many people have that women can't be assertive in the office.
Yes, and it's certainly a problem that women have faced in diplomatic life since the early modern era, which is that there are people who are uncomfortable with their tendency to be confident because they do have the experience necessary. And then there are people who fault them for not being sufficiently confident. So to some extent, we have what I call an underpowered and an overpowered narrative. So either way, it's as if they cannot do anything right because they are either too strong for the position or not sufficiently assertive. So finding that middle path is always a challenge. But in the vice presidential nominee that we see for 2020, we see Senator Harris as somebody who has beat the odds. I mean, she's become a path breaker, a trailblazer in many different respects. Certainly, becoming the senator from California is itself, quite an astonishing feat. Given that she, as a high school student, for example, lived in Montreal, right?
Mm-hmm.
She wasn't the child of generations of Americans. She certainly didn't come out of a background like let's say George H.W. Bush or his son George W. People who were part of a long-standing establishment tradition. But I think that gives candidates like Senator Harris, gives them a certain level of connection to the general public that really matters, particularly in difficult times like we're living through.
Absolutely. I noticed not even 24 hours after Kamala's nomination was announced, her candidacy as vice president, that there was an article, I think from Vogue magazine, about her fashion sense. And I know we saw that with Hillary Clinton as well. People criticized her for her fashion sense. You talk about her marriage as well. These are things that tend to be focused on for a female politician that are not necessarily focused on for a male politician. Why? Why diminish women in leadership this way?
Well, I think we live in a very visual age, and this can be very difficult for women in public life because the idea that a woman is a commodity, that she's a visual, physical image, and that we're going to proceed to dissect her the way society generally dissects women, in terms of their voice, their personal life, how they dress, their hair. That trivialization, which I would have to emphasize in my research on Canada, is attributable as much to women journalists as to men. And the unwillingness to refer to these women by their qualifications. She is Senator Harris. She's not somebody's next door neighbor or cousin or something. And the fact that she's referred to by her first name and that people forget about her qualifications and her policy stands, I think is something that's highly detrimental to women in public life. And as I say, it is not a problem that is unique to male commentators and male politicians. I think we all absorb this notion that we can kind of trivialize and dissect women without any of the attention to the fact that men in public life are never discussed in terms of the fact that they all tend to wear, navy blue suits, maybe, don't do much with their hair. I mean, the point is, it's just a norm because they are the normative politician. They get away with whatever they get away with. Whereas women politicians, and certainly Senator Clinton at the time, was dissected for her pantsuits. She said that she could throw any world crisis off the front page of the American media if she changed her hairstyle. And that, I think, speaks to this trivialization.
Let's get closer to home. Chrystia Freeland announced yesterday as the first woman appointed as finance minister while still being deputy prime minister. This is a big step for Canadian politics. Talk about the importance of this step.
Oh, I think Chrystia Freeland's appointment as finance minister at the federal level is hugely important because we have had women finance ministers in provinces, including British Columbia, Saskatchewan, Ontario, but we've never had a woman finance minister at the federal level. And so I think it's a very significant breakthrough, and it's a significant breakthrough at a time when the country's fiscal situation is very serious, and we need leadership. I don't think there's any Canadian who would say that we can just leave the job vacant or something.
You spoke at the beginning, Professor Bashevkin, about the fact that people just, as the world, we just need to get used to women in leadership. But we look back at the history of our country and the fact that there's only been about 12 female premiers in our history, including our Prime Minister, Kim Campbell, for a couple of short weeks. Why is it that the Canadian public seems to be hesitant about electing a female leader? We've only seen a couple in our history.
Well, I'm not sure that the public is hesitant. I mean, there have been some Canadian women politicians who won election with landslides. They've governed very effectively. We just tend to forget the good news stories and remember the bad news stories. So, for example, if you look in Prince Edward Island, Catherine Colbeck was premier there with a very, very large majority government. We saw Kathleen Wynne turn the Ontario Liberals from a very precarious minority to a very strong majority government. after the resignation of Dalton McGuinty. I mean, we forget that it was Rachel Notley who brought the Alberta NDP to power after they had never been in power in the history of Alberta. So there are good news stories, but again, it's a bit like, the question about women politicians in the United States, and why is it that there's so much coverage of, I don't know, their hair, their clothes, their weight, their family lives? It's because these become the tropes that we repeat. And instead of thinking about actually all the important breakthroughs, I mean, I would point to Chrystia Freeland's background as our global affairs minister, as our foreign minister, where she took on arguably an impossible job, which was to try and keep a trilateral trade agreement among Canada, the United States, and Mexico after the election of the Trump administration. She faced a president of the United States and a trade representative who were telling the press that they didn't like Chrystia Freeland, they didn't like Canada's representative.
They were very
and she persevered. And to his credit, the prime minister stood behind her, and we now have an agreement. Now, the fact that the White House is hitting us with all kinds of tariffs and so on, that's, I think, just a function of what happens in Washington. But the capacity of Chrystia Freeland as our foreign minister, I think, should not be underestimated, nor her capacity since 2019 as our deputy prime minister and minister of intergovernmental relations. After all, she was the one who had to go into Alberta and other parts of the country where there was a sense that the 2019 elections didn't really give enough voice to certain anti-liberal interests in this country. And she has a very effective interpersonal style that I think has permitted this government to stay in office without any serious threats to confidence in the House of Commons since last fall. So again, I think we need to look at her qualifications, look at her accomplishments, and not get into the tropes that talk about, what a woman can't do, or shouldn't we talk about, something foolish like, I don't know, how she dresses or how she speaks or the tone of her voice. These kinds of, trivial commodity-like treatments of women, I think, are getting us into a rut where we forget about how much these women have contributed and how impatient the public is with this treatment of public leaders.
But with 12 female premiers, including Kim Campbell as our prime minister, what is something stopping from women getting more into the political realm? Why aren't we seeing the number increase? I guess that's my question.
Sure. Well, I mean, look, the treatment of women in contemporary public life puts off lots of people. There are lots of younger women that I meet as my students, for example, who ask who would ever get involved in public life. With the rise of social media, we're seeing much more trivialization. We're seeing threats of violence. We're seeing actual violence directed against women in public life. We know that one of our federal cabinet ministers, Catherine McKinnon, has faced all kinds of threats to her personal safety and to her office. And we know that this is not unique to Canada, and it's not unique to federal politics in this country. So the threats that were directed against former Premier Wynne in Ontario, the threats that were directed against former Premier Notley in Alberta, these have been documented in Ontario by the OPP, in Alberta by the RCMP. These women face more serious and more frequent threats to their bodily integrity than the men who held office before them, and in the case of those who've had their successors in office for a while, the men who've succeeded them. So the reasons why women don't want to get involved in large part are linked to the very issues we talk about, which is how welcoming is that climate for public leaders, particularly for women leaders and particularly for progressive women leaders, women of the center left and left. That's where the pushback seems to be the most severe, and where the deterrents to good women getting involved, and good men as well, are probably among the most serious.
Yeah, and what is the temperature you think for the right? I mean, we look at Rona Ambrose, who was interim leader but stopped and didn't want to go forward with conservative leadership. What would be your assessment of that side of the table?
Well, the research suggests that the pushback against women on the right is not as severe as against women on the left, and it's largely because the hostility to progressive women comes from regressive men, comes from men on the right. So the organized opposition that faced Notley and Wynne was often in opposition, for example, to their positions on sex education in Ontario, same-sex and sexual orientation reforms in Alberta. That is usually coming from the political right. And that's where these women are facing some very serious challenges. In the case of Senator Harris in the US, we don't know where the pushback is going to come because it hasn't quite happened yet. But we can imagine that, like most capital D Democratic politicians in the US, she is going to continue to face hostility from the media organizations on the right, as have women in Ontario and Alberta premiers' offices. In terms of the physical threats against women premiers of the political right, we have not seen the same level of hostility. If we look at Alberta, Premier Alison Redford, who preceded Premier Rachel Notley, did not face the same frequency nor hostility and of the threats, according to the RCMP reports. And so that suggests that there is a left-right dynamic here, which means that the political right is particularly targeting left and center-left women. And here we're talking about white women. We're talking about issues that are not about race. Right. So if we were to imagine in Canada, for example, the rise of women in political parties, possibly as candidates to be premier, candidates to be prime minister, who are coming from racialized backgrounds, from ethnocultural minorities, who are Indigenous, I fear that we might see patterns similar to those that we see unfolding in the US since the nomination of Senator Harris as Democratic vice presidential candidate.
Leslie Ann Lewis is a perfect example of a conservative candidate for the leadership who has faced some pushback, but has stood strong as well. What are your thoughts of how she's been treated in the media and by others?
Well, again, because in the case of the federal Conservative Party leadership, because they're an opposition party, they're not in power, the scrutiny is a little different from the media. And because we haven't yet seen the selection of the leader, it's a little different in terms of the amount of scrutiny. Also, because the Conservative Party is generally the party of choice in English Canada, at least, for media organizations on the right, I'm not sure that she would get the same difficult ride, let's say, the same harsh treatment as a woman from a similar background who was leading the Liberals or the NDP or maybe the Bloc Québécois, in terms of parties that are more towards the center left and left.
Right.
So, the political right tends to have some kid gloves towards its own and very, very much takes off the gloves, it would appear, in its treatment of women from other parts of the spectrum.
As we look at the U.S., we saw the treatment of Sarah Palin many years ago. Again, somebody who was in the Republican Party, but was not treated very fairly within the media. I mean, she didn't do a lot of favors for herself as well, but was parodied a lot and criticized a lot through her candidacy. What are your thoughts?
Well, look, I think people who go forward for public office have to be ready for scrutiny, right? So, I mean, what is fair? What is unfair? There's an argument that in politics, perception is reality, and whatever the Republican Party was thinking with the nomination of Sarah Palin, presumably they would have been well advised to prepare her better for whatever was going to await her. They must have seen some of these likely questions. I think, men in public life are facing a great deal of scrutiny as well. So I don't know that these problems are entirely unique to women, but I do think that what we're seeing in the initial response to Senator Harris's nomination as vice president, that is probably going to prelude a somewhat harsher treatment than what we saw with Sarah Palin and possibly Geraldine Ferraro as well, in part because she's part of a ticket right now that is leading the Republican Trump-Pence ticket. And I think, President Trump wants very much to remain in the Oval Office, and Vice President Pence wants to keep his office, his position. So this is, this is very much a rough sport. I presume the Democratic Party has prepared Senator Harris for whatever is about to await her, because there are lots of very experienced political handlers there who also had to prepare people going back to Jimmy Carter and Bill Clinton Michael Dukakis, and any number of other Democratic nominees, both for president and vice president.
I don't know if you can prepare anybody for the onslaught of what is to come when it comes to American politics. What would you say to, and I'm assuming that you do when you're speaking to your students in your political science classes, what would you say to young women, especially of color, who are looking at Senator Harris and others who are rising up within the ranks as women of color wanting to take a seat at the table in the political spectrum? How would you encourage them?
Well, I encourage them, to find a mentor, to find a political party, to find a cause, often to have some experience with an issue. Because I think one of the things that really has faced a lot of women in public life, as you suggest, is this trivialization, this dissection of them as commodities, as physical beings, not as policy channels. Men tend to be analyzed in terms of where they stand on issues, and women in terms of how they look. I mean, it's often just that trivial. So I often encourage my students, women and men from all backgrounds, to try and make sure that they have a reason to get into public life and a track record that helps to explain to the general public, the people who might be voting for them, why they should be elected. And so, because so many women come into public life with a cause, whether it's better schools or better health care or ensuring that women and girls in the global South have access to nutrition and to educational training. I mean, many of my students are very, very passionate about these issues, and so I encourage them to kind of build a track record and find mentors along the way who will help them move into these positions. Because trying to do it on your own is very painful and quite impossible. And so they're out there doing it, and we can see over time that there are more examples of women from diverse backgrounds. Certainly, the experiences of Jody Wilson-Raybould as the member of Parliament for Vancouver Granville, that inspired many of my students from Indigenous backgrounds who said, "Okay, it's tough, it's difficult, but it's possible to build a national profile and to really stand for the issues that you care about."
Yeah. And I guess my last question would be, as we look at the vice presidency candidacy with Senator Harris, again, this trailblazer who has stepped up in the ranks, what do you hope that people will see beyond her gender, beyond her race, that they will focus on when it comes to Senator Harris and what she can bring to the table?
Well, I hope they focus on her insight and her energy and the experience and the equanimity that she would bring to senior office. I think what has a lot of people concerned about the candidacy of Joe Biden is his age, right? And so she needs to prove that were she to step into the Oval Office as president, that she has the capacity to weigh different points of view, and that she brings to the position the insight and the ability to operate in a team that we don't see from the current occupant of the Oval Office. So those are the kinds of strengths, I think, that she needs to demonstrate in a campaign. And because she's an experienced campaigner, I think she will be able to bring that to the table. Because some of the other people that the Democrats were considering, notably Susan Rice, who's very capable, but she's never run for office. So here's a woman from an African American and South Asian background who really has had experience in local as well as state and federal politics, and connects with people. And I think that's what voters will be looking for in a period when they're concerned about the age of the presidential candidate, and things are so anxious, so unstable. People are carrying a lot of discomfort about, these anxious times. And so I think she has the capacity to really reassure people.
So much to discuss. Thank you again, Professor Sylvia Bashevkin, for joining us today.
Thank you.